Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me. It's been great being in Marseille so far. So this is joint with Guillermo and Ricardo on corruption and impunity. It's we haven't submitted this anywhere yet, so we're still sort of looking for feedback that could potentially change the paper drastically. So any kind of comments is welcome. So many believe that corruption is a major impediment to economic development, and one of the reasons why corruption is so pervasive in many places could be that the corrupt are able to get away with their crimes by hiring expensive lawyers or compromising law enforcement officials and so on. And indeed, there are many qualitative accounts of this happening in many different countries. But we don't have many quantitative studies using actual court data to measure impunity. As a consequence, we still have a lot to learn about how pervasive this is, what explains it, and what the consequences might be. And one of the reasons why we don't have that many quantitative studies is probably because it's very hard to measure impunity. So to give you an idea, this is one of the quantitative papers that is out there by Helmke et al. They study the prosecution of ex-presidents in Latin America. And they found, for instance, that this ex-president in Mexico was not prosecuted for corruption after leaving office. Does that mean there is impunity in Mexico? Not necessarily, because it could be that Peña Nieto was in fact not corrupt. And similarly, this guy in Bolivia was prosecuted after leaving office. Does that mean that in Bolivia there is not impunity? Not necessarily, because it could be that Rodriguez was prosecuted not because of the corruption, but because of the incoming new Evo Morales administration wanted to get rid of an enemy. So it could be political persecution. So what we do in this paper is that we try to sort of deal with this challenge by exploiting these very famous randomized Brazilian federal audits that even some people in this room have been using. So these audits are very famous in the literature. We know that they uncover serious irregularities that are punishable by law. So if there's no legal consequences of these audits, then this is sort of a strong sign of impunity. And conversely, if we see punishment because of the audit, this seems to be unlikely to be political persecutions, because you don't need an audit to engage in political persecution. The second challenge is, of course, to identify these court cases and track them and figure out what the outcome are. To do this, we engage in a huge data collection effort. We start with sort of the universe of lawsuits in Brazil between 2010 and 2020. They come in these huge PDFs like this. We identify criminal cases, and these cases here, improbidade administrativa, these are sort of corruption-related cases that cannot lead to imprisonment, but they can lead to fines and the politician not being able to run for office again. So we find the names of the defendants and we match them by perfect name matching to names of politicians. So this works quite well in Brazil because people tend to have very rare names. Half of the population in Brazil have a unique name. And these corruption-related cases, they tend to involve politicians, so then the likelihood of a false match is even smaller. And then after we have found these court cases, we go and look we collect more detailed information from federal courts in this blue region here. So this is sort of the region that covers most of the Brazilian states. And we look at the federal courts because these are federal audits that typically lead to lawsuits in the federal courts. And for these cases, we get extremely detailed information about what happens with these cases. And we get the full text of the decisions of the judge, like including a detailed description of the case and the arguments and so on. And we do this for trial courts, appeal courts, the Superior Court, and the Supreme Court. So this way we can sort of track these cases through the court system over almost 2 decades after the audit. Question?
Clarification question, but the PDF court data, do they all relate to the randomized program?
The court case data?
Yeah, the court case data, do they all come from the procedure initiated by the random audits question?
No, so these are all, we're starting with all court cases that are about corruption, but we're going to use the random audits to see like which one are caused, or like we can identify the causal effect of the audit, and we can see if it increases the number of lawsuits. And then we can also look inside the lawsuits and see if they mention the audits. I'm going to do that. Yeah. But we start with all the lawsuits. Ale.
How do we identify that this is a corruption case versus some other case? So is there any?
Yeah, so for these improbidade cases, they are all about corruption, basically. They can only be about corruption or like irregularities in the administration. But the criminal cases, we're not making any such selection. It's hard to know if a criminal case, from our data, it's hard to know if a criminal case is about like drug trafficking or corruption. I mean, we have some information, but not for all the states. So then we're just picking all criminal cases. But typically, if it's a criminal case against a politician, it's something related to corruption. Okay, so why do we do this in Brazil? So apart from the data availability, Brazil is interesting because it's a setting where judges and prosecutors are considered to be extremely independent. So they are hired with a competitive exam. They have very strong job protections, very high salaries, and only a few of them are politically nominated. So if we find that there is impunity even in this setting, it means that judicial independence is not a sufficient condition to fight impunity. And in fact, there is a strong sense of impunity in Brazil. There's even a term for corruption cases ending in nothing, which is that they end up in a pizza. And the image is that the judge and the prosecutor and the defendants will share a pizza, and sort of the case disappears. All right, so we're going to see if this sort of popular conception is right, and if it's right, why is it so? The first question is whether the audits led to any court cases or indictments at all by the prosecutors. And to measure this, we're using sort of a standard Callaway-Santana diff in diff method, essentially comparing the audited mayor here with the non-audited mayor, and see if the audited mayor see more court cases after the audit. And this is, since the audits are random, we are sure that we get a causal effect here. Here's the main event plot. This is the years before the audit. There are no differences. Then after the audit, we see a sharp increase in the number of corruption cases filed against these audited mayors. We have looked at bureaucrats as well. We don't see a jump for bureaucrats. We don't see a jump for city councilors, but we see it for the mayor. And it's a huge increase. This represents roughly a 25% increase in the number of corruption cases filed against these mayors. And these are all the audits, no matter what the audit finds. For the audits that find stronger, more evidence of irregularities, we see an even larger jump. And also interesting, you see that this takes, the effect is there even 5 years, 6 years after the audit, which means that sometimes it takes prosecutors a lot of time to develop this case and file the lawsuits. So these were misconduct cases in probidade, and here it is for criminal cases. We see a bit more noisy results, but it's similar. Question?
So just a clarification question on the structure of the audits. Are the audits really targeting the mayor or the municipality and irregularities in the municipality? Because it could be that these guys are not more corrupted than others, just they have the spotlights on them, and therefore cases are filed against them.
Yeah, so they are, the audits, they audit the entire municipality or maybe just parts of the municipality. And well, it's not clear that if the audit finds an irregularity, it's not clear that it should implicate the mayor. It could be some like low-level corruption where the mayor is not involved, which is why we also looked at if there was cases against the bureaucrats. But it turns out that the effect is only for cases against the mayor. Of course, it doesn't mean that the audited mayors are more corrupt than the non-audited mayors, because they cannot be, because it's random. But it's discovered in these cases. That's the interpretation. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first is, do the auditors know that it's random audits? In the sense that, for example, for tax audit, it's been shown that when the auditor knows that it's random audit, they investigate much less, and it's very unlikely that they can uncover very sophisticated forms of evasion. So, do they know whether it's audit or not, which could have an implication on their involvement? And the second question is, how easy it is to just observe corruption, because a lot of corruption just goes orally. There is no document proving that there is corruption. So what is your sense about the probability of detection of corruption?
Great. So I think this is two questions. Yeah. So the first question is if they know that they're going to be audited. So there is a randomization, and then they will know that okay, we are picked out to be audited, but then it's the previous year, so you can't. I mean, you probably try to document your spending the last year or something. Maybe I'm not sure exactly if that happens, but it's about you're going to be audited for what you spent on the last year. So it's not that you can sort of try to hide that easily.
The question was more: do the auditors, those who audit, implement the audit, do they know that it's a random program?
Yeah, they know. And then the second question was what? Sorry, what was the second question?
What is the probability of detection? I know it's a.
Yeah. Okay, I remember. Yeah. So, I mean, the auditors would find things like, okay, there was spent money on books in this school, but the books are not there, or they could see like, okay, this public procurement auction, like all the firms submitted the same bid. It looks like it was a simulated auction, or they can see like indications of corruption, but of course not proving corruption. So that's so it's not like necessarily clear that these cases should end in convictions. Yeah, because it's just indication; it's not proof.
What's the fraction of positive? Audits actually finding corruption?
I think most of the audits they find some irregularities. I don't have more precise numbers, but of course it varies between the municipalities. Ali.
So what is the ratio of the mayor directly being involved in corruption? So what I'm thinking from here, for example, books are not given to the school and it is paid. It might be kind of a lower level person who might have been involved and not the mayor actually themselves.
Yeah.
So, or are they directly involved, or
definitely? So I
mean,
mean,
shows up in the report.
Of course, it's a hard question. I don't know the answer to it, but according to the prosecutors, the mayors are involved because they tend to file cases against the mayor. But this is sort of the prosecutor's interpretation of the evidence, and I haven't gone and like made my own opinion if they are involved or not. It might be that prosecutors just want to sort of enter against the mayor because he's sort of the most powerful person in the municipality, even that they might not have much evidence. Okay. So we can sort of go into the decisions in these court cases for those that are decided to figure out exactly what are the audit findings that the judges are discussing, and using sort of standard plagiarism detection algorithms. And 30% of the lawsuits, they do mention the audits. And when they mention the audit, it's typically the more serious irregularities, what you would expect. Yeah. Okay, so could it be that these lawsuits are political persecutions? We don't think so. First, because you don't need an audit to engage in political persecution. You can just invent your own evidence. And second, these prosecutors are extremely independent from local politics. And we don't find any patterns such as politicians aligned with the presidents being less likely to be prosecuted or something like that. And also we find that the effect is driven by the audits that find more irregularities, and we find that these lawsuits that are caused by the audits are more likely to lead to conviction. So they are stronger cases than usual.
For political persecutions, for example, if you could go through via audit, then it would be more legitimate for the incumbent, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe the first point is not the perfect. I mean, it might not always be valid because, like, well, it's more convenient to when there is actually some other evidence there. Yeah.
And as a follow-up to Agnes' question, how do you interpret the fact that you only find an effect for mayors and not for the rest of the municipality with line of political persecution?
Yeah, it's a bit strange. So maybe one of the reasons is that there are so many. I mean, I'm not sure if this is the right explanation, but there are many lawsuits against bureaucrats, and probably much more lawsuits than are related to the audits. But for the mayors, there's sort of like not that many. So a sort of an increase of 20 cases or like 10 cases, it will show up more easily. But yeah, we were surprised to not see effects for bureaucrats. I'm not sure exactly why. Because they would typically also be implicated in these lawsuits against the mayors. But statistically, we cannot detect an effect. Okay, so what happens to the lawsuits? Are these ex-mayors convicted? So first, when we're looking at the trial courts, we find that actually a sizable proportion of the lawsuits lead to convictions. But there are also quite a few that are still undecided, which is kind of, well, these have been undecided and they've been undecided for 10 or 15 years. So some of these cases take a long time, and they're still ongoing at the trial, in the trial courts. So does this mean that there is not impunity in Brazil because we see these convictions? Well, not necessarily, because now we get the appeals. So as long as you appeal, you don't serve your sentence in Brazil. This is the same in France and in most civil law countries. And of course, all the convicted ex-mayors, they appeal. And once we take into account the appeals, we get the following picture. So this is among the trial court convictions. We see just a small share of cases where we get the conviction confirmed on appeal. And same for misconduct cases. A very large share of misconduct cases are still undecided. And for the criminal cases, a lot of them have prescribed, which means that the judge have considered them to have moved too slowly to lead to a punishment. So in Brazil, this prescriptive period also applies between the trial court decision and the appeal. So this might be that the time between the trial court conviction and the appeal decision has been too long, for instance, or the time between the corrupt act and the filing of the case was deemed to have taken too long. And of course, you have the Superior Court and the Supreme Court on top of this. So once we take into account these further appeals, the final picture looks like this. So extremely small share of final convictions here. And what are these final convictions? We have 18 fines, 15 politicians barred from elections, 1 community service sentence, and 1 incarceration sentence. This incarceration sentence is a bit strange because for some reason the guy did not appeal, and that was the reason why he actually had to serve the sentence, or maybe something has happened, that he died or something, that he did not appeal. For the fines, these are relatively small fines. The majority of them are less than 2 months of a salary of the mayor. This guy is barred from elections. This happens way after they have quitted politics. So let me show you here. This is the time since they have last run for election and their final conviction. So we see here, this is like 9 years, 10 years, 11 years after they last ran for office. So this doesn't seem to have much of a bite. There's 2 here that got convicted 2 years after they ran for office, but they did not appeal. If they had appealed, they could have run for office again. So it doesn't seem like this getting barred from election has any bite.
Oh, sorry, what's the y-axis here?
Number of cases. Here you see the fines. This is the number of monthly salaries. 1 and 2, this is sort of the most common ones. But there are some very large fines here. So if they are ever collected, then that's a big punishment. But to collect these fines, you need to start a new lawsuit to sort of execute the sentence, and we haven't looked at that yet. So overall, we have mostly 4 small fines, 1 community service sentence, and 1 incarceration sentence. What about the cases that are still ongoing? Maybe there might be more convictions in the future because these cases are still ongoing. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like that is the case. So most of these cases that are still undecided, nothing has happened in them for the last 5 or 10 years, which means that they might probably abandoned for some reason. So for cases still waiting for a trial court decision, the last year something happened in that case. Any minor step happened was in 2015. But the cases that are pending a decision in the Superior Court, they seem to be still active. But the majority of these cases don't seem to be actively going for some reason. So to sort of guess what might happen, what might be the final outcome of this case, we can engage in the following exercise, assuming that judges in the future will decide all cases at the same rate as they do today. So for instance, a case filed in 2014 and not decided by 2021 by the end of our data, assume that the probability it will be decided in 2022 equals the rate at which judges decide 8-year-old cases. And then the probability it's decided in 2023 equals the rate at which judges decide 9-year-old cases, and so on. So this is similar to how we calculate life expectancy. So once we do this is sort of our predicted outcomes for all the cases. For misconduct cases, we predict that even 17 years after the filing, 60% of them are going to be still undecided. And for the criminal cases, our prediction is that almost 60% of the criminal cases are eventually going to prescribe, to have been deemed to have moved too slowly to lead to a punishment. And we predict this to happen like 15 years after they were filed. Okay, so sort of the conclusion is that the popular conception is more or less correct, that there is impunity for corruption in Brazil. At least when looking at these federal courts that we've been looking at. So what explains it? We're considering 4 factors. Yep.
Just a clarification question. So these graphs were only on these random audits of these mayors?
Let me see. I think these were all the cases filed against the audited mayors after the audit.
After this program?
Yeah, after the audit happened, but they might not all be related to the audit.
Okay.
Yeah, because for the undecided cases, we can't know if they are actually related to the audit or not because we don't have the full judge's decision yet. Yeah.
So here, the descriptive statistics you've been showing for a couple of slides are all from your treated group, right?
Yeah.
So did you look into whether the treatment increases the probability of a case ending in a conviction or? Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So we did that, and it does.
It does.
Even it increases the probability of a final conviction. Even though the probability of a final conviction is extremely small, it increases that probability.
Okay.
So
Audits are decisive.
Yeah. Just effect is very small for final convictions.
Number 2. So sure, maybe trials don't do anything to you per se, so they won't put you in jail, but they might have other costs, like a reputational cost that prevents you from running. Did you look into that, or is that what you're about to talk about?
Yeah, so we haven't looked at whether you run. I think other papers have looked at whether you run or not after being audited, which could be because of reputation. And of course, there would be large reputational costs from being indicted in these lawsuits, and also big lawyer costs. So the fact that you're not punished does not mean that there is no. I mean, you're not formally punished, but there is de facto punishment because you have to hire a lawyer, you get reputational costs, and so on. Yeah.
But could you quantify that? Maybe not the sort of cost of having a lawyer, but the effect of audits preventing you from running that's mediated by indictments.
Good idea. I should think about that.
And also a question about the data, but how severe is the corruption we are talking about here? Do you have any sense, or do you have any way to observe this in the data?
I don't know, apart from reading the audit reports and giving some qualitative measures, I don't know how to measure that.
Yeah, I guess it's complicated. I was just wondering about it because when we see the results about the conclusion of those trials, it would be interesting to get a sense about how big is the corruption.
Yeah. So, I mean, in general, the perception is that these audits, they uncover very serious irregularities. But, well, the fact that we don't see punishment, it could be because, well, they're not really serious enough, or it's hard to prove that this was the mayor or this was, but we do see a lot of, the fact that we do see a lot of trial court convictions, it means that the judge at the trial court, they saw this as evidence of corruption that was punishable by law. Yeah.
And do you have some kind of reference situation compared to the corruption related to the mayors? Or are these very low rate conditions also something that you would expect when corruption does not come from politicians?
Yeah, no, very good comment, and we haven't looked at that, but we should, and see if we look at cases against bureaucrats, if we see more punishments there. Thanks.
Sorry, so I was wondering about the fraction of cases that are brought to court. It seems so. Yeah, maybe there are too many cases being opened after small audits, not too serious. So because we would like to know, like to scale those figures somehow to the, when the offense is serious, whether the statistics are more favorable, or if it's not an effect of somehow, I don't know, where would it come from? Maybe it's inefficiently high, the number of cases.
Yeah, I mean, so one interpretation could be that this is like prosecutors being overzealous and entering with a lot of frivolous cases, maybe because of public pressure or political persecutions.
It's
or
not linked to that, right? It's not conditional on the number of cases. Is it? No, I guess. The prosecutor is a fixed wage, right?
the
Yeah.
the
The judge, I mean, the people who start.
It's a fixed number of prosecutors, but they can enter with more lawsuits, right?
Wait, so they don't have any financial incentives in fighting a lot of cases?
Not really, but they might have informal incentives like that too.
In any case, having a sense of among the audit, I know it's probably time consuming and looking at all the text of those audits, but among the audits that give some evidence of something reprehensible, what's the share that is brought to court?
Yeah, I don't have that number, but we do find that the audits that find more irregularities that lead to more lawsuits. We do that, but it's a good idea. But it's a large share of these audited mayors who are indicted. So 50% of the mayors, they have at least one court case against them after. Thanks. Okay, so now for the second part of the papers, we're trying to explain this impunity and why it happens. And of course, one of the reasons is these Brazilian prescription rules. I'm not going to have time to go into details about them, but they're kind of a statute of limitation that they are applicable to all of the stages of the process, from the crime to the indictment, indictment to the trial court conviction to the appeal court conviction. So there are like time limits for each of these steps of the lawsuit, and the length of this prescription period depends on the received sentence. So it applies retroactively. So it might be that the judge is like finally deciding the case, and it's only 1 year of prison, and then but if it's only 1 year of prison, then it was filed too late. So that's why, like, one of the reasons why we see so many of these. And also the prescription length is halved when you turn 70. So then when you turn 70, like basically all of these cases disappear because then it was too late. So this is sort of a major explanation of the impunity for the criminal cases. And then we have the appeals. So mechanically, appeals tend to favor defendants because defendants have a much higher likelihood of appealing. So in the data, convicted defendants appeal in 90% of cases, but if there's an acquittal, the prosecutor appeals in only 30% of them. It's also the case that appeal court judges are a bit more lenient. So if you add these two factors up, then you go from a 60% conviction rate in the data to a 42% conviction rate, just mechanically. And then, of course, if you add one more layer of appeals, you're down to 32%, a third layer down to 25%. So you have multiple appeal opportunities, then, well, at one point you might be lucky to find a lenient judge, and then you're free. But appeals, they also favor impunity by causing delay. So to give you, yep.
Isn't it the case that the procedure will cost more to them than the fine will? Because I guess it must be quite costly to have trials over and over. And because you showed that the fines are actually pretty small.
Yeah, so I mean, for these like small fines, like easily the cost of a lawyer is much higher than those fines. Definitely.
So why do they appeal?
I mean, so the point here is that for those who only get a small fine, they don't appeal. That's why we have a final conviction. So the only final convictions are those who receive a small fine. Those that receive a large fine, they appeal. So it's kind of a selection effect. Yeah.
It might be a good idea to try to get a sense of the cost of like 1 year of legal proceedings. The lawyer cost, just to and maybe relative to daily wage, get a sense of the amounts at stake, right?
Yeah. Thanks. I think it's a bit expensive, but not overly expensive, because we're going to show that actually poorer mayors, ex-mayors, they engage in the same amount of appeals and proceedings as the richer ones. So we don't see much differences in terms of the money of the mayor, for instance.
Doesn't the state carry that cost of appeal?
Yeah, so the state in criminal cases, the state can give you a public defendant, but in most of these politicians, they hire a private lawyer, which they pay for themselves.
Okay, because I know in other contexts, the state will pay for that private lawyer on behalf of the
Yeah.
defendant, because it was during office in the state position.
Okay, I should check. So maybe the state will cover some of your private lawyer, but I'm sure that these ex-mayors, they don't go for a public defender here. Thanks. Yep.
Do you interpret this very low conviction rate as something specific to corruption that is very hard to prove, or something specific to Brazil and that is very low punished? And to try and answer this question, have you tried to have a sense of this conviction rate for corruption in other contexts, in other countries?
So I don't have data on other countries, but one thing that we're going to do is to check like for other types of cases in Brazil, like typical criminal cases. Like do we see the same kind of pattern, like impunity, like drug trafficking? So the key difference is that for like other types of crime, like violent crimes or drug trafficking, you're in pre-trial detention, so you're sort of punished. It doesn't make sense to sort of engage in these procrastinatory appeals because you're already like in jail. But it might be for other kinds of cases that we see the same pattern, like cases where you're not in pre-trial detention. I assume that this is not something specific about corruption in Brazil. I think this is like more general than that. But of course, we're also very interested in knowing how this is in other countries. And this might be something that is very specific to Brazil. Okay, so to sort of understand the sources of delay, let me walk you through the steps of a typical lawsuits and give you the median duration of each step. So, as I said, the investigation phase takes a long time. This is the time between the audit and the prosecutor entering with the case. It's on median 5 years. Substantial delay from this phase. And then, well, it takes on median 1 year for the court to serve the case to the defendant, to tell the defendant that there's a court case against you. The court has to find the defendant and so on. It's like, takes a lot of time. And then the defendant has a pre-defense, and then the judge will accept or deny the case, which takes like almost half a year. And then the defendant needs to be served a second time, to be found a second time and be told that, well, the case was accepted. And then there's the real defense. And then, of course, it takes time to sort of collect evidence and prepare for the oral hearing. And there's also congestion here. Then there's the final arguments, and then it takes the judge almost a year to write the sentence. And now we're 8.7 years after the audits already when we start the appeals. So first, you can ask for a clarification. Then you can appeal the decision properly to the appeal court. And sort of a major delay is the appeal court deciding the appeal. This takes 2 years on average, on the median, because of congestion. Then you can ask for a clarification. Then you can appeal to the superior court. This is typically denied by the appeal court vice president, but you can appeal that denial, and the case is sent to the superior court. And the superior court typically confirms the denial, but this takes over a year. Then you can ask for larger judicial panels of superior court judges to review that confirmation of the denial. And you can then ask for a clarification. And then you can appeal to the Supreme Court, which is typically denied. This appeal is denied by the superior court. But then you can ask for a larger panel to review this denial. And you can sort of appeal it again, and it enters the Supreme Court. You can ask for a larger panel of Supreme Court judges. You can ask for a clarification of that, and then the case ends. As far as I know, there's nothing more you can do at this stage but to accept your punishment. The problem is that we don't have in our data any case that made it all this way. So these numbers here are taken from other cases, like even older cases, because typically the case is stuck somewhere before it enters these last stages. Okay, so it seems apparent that the number of appeals is a major source of delay. You have 12 possible appeals, even for cases that are not accepted to any of the superior courts. And there's also an unlimited number of interlocutory appeals and what's called preventive habeas corpus that you can enter with sort of to delay the case at any point in time. There's a potential vicious cycle here. A court congestion will give you incentives to enter with these procrastinating appeals, which again clogs up the courts and potentially leads to more of these kinds of appeals. We don't have much evidence of this, but we're looking more. Well, there might be some other reasons for delay beyond this. One is judges' incentives. So judges in Brazil, they are measured, like their productivity is monitored, the number of cases they decide, and it's very complicated to decide these corruption cases, and it gives you just 1 point. So it's sort of for judges who care about their promotions, they might focus on easier cases. And we sort of have some evidence of that in the data, that judges who sort of, they look like they're judges that likely care more about their incentives for promotions, judges who have not been in the same district for many years, they likely sort of look for a promotion to a different place. They are less likely to decide these corruption cases. Another potential source of delay is the rotation of judges. So judges who, there's a lot of rotation, so it might be that a new judge who comes to a district would be sort of reluctant to start deciding an old corruption case that the previous judge knows a lot about, but you don't know about. But actually, we don't see much evidence of that. So when there's a new judge coming in, this is the likelihood. On the y-axis, it's the likelihood of deciding a pending corruption case. And this is the months after a new judge arrives. And actually, it's an increase, if anything, in the likelihood of deciding old cases. So this is not part of the explanation. And of course, we have the undecided cases. We don't know why these cases are not decided. We can only speculate why they are never decided, but maybe judges at one point realized that it's sort of meaningless to decide these cases where the politician has retired 10 years ago, or maybe even being dead, or so they're not deciding these old cases because like deciding them would not provide any meaningful sense of justice. But that's the speculation on our part. Okay. So what might be the consequences of this impunity? This is something that we want to do more on, but we don't have a lot of sort of variation in the data to exploit, so we don't have much on this so far. But what we've been looking at, question?
Sorry, just before you start on this section, so far what you presented suggests that the independence of the judiciary in Brazil, at least, is not the sufficient condition to fight impunity, right? And the evidence you suggested about judges' incentive might need to be completed. In fact, I mean, if you have only bad fishes in the sea, just removing one of them will not change the problem. So, in a way, when we think about impunity here and problem incentive, it might be interesting to compare case delay when the judge adjudicates cases filed against politicians versus cases filed against bureaucrats, for instance. And if there you see statistically significant effect, it means that these cases take significantly longer for judges to adjudicate, meaning that they might have an incentive to actually take more time, right? They don't care as much about this case anymore.
Yeah, so it's a great idea. It's a bit hard to know, like if it takes longer time with a corruption case, is it because it's like very complicated and very hard to decide, or because they sort of procrastinate and they don't want to touch these cases? It's a bit difficult to know, but I agree. We should try to dig more into that. All right, so here is sort of our idea of sort of looking at the effect of impunity on corruption is to exploit that different municipalities here in white, they are grouped into judicial districts in this way, like 20 municipalities in one district in the federal courts. And these borders are maybe not arbitrary, but there might be some randomness in exactly how these borders are drawn. And we sort of have one sort of promising result so far, but it's sort of very shaky. But we find that, well, if the municipality is in a judicial district with more backlog, or where judges take more time to decide corruption cases, then we see that in the audits there are more serious irregularities. But we don't find an increase in like minor irregularities or formal errors. But this result, it's not very robust. And the reason is that we have quite few of these audited municipalities, so we're looking into finding measures of corruption that will cover more of the municipalities and not only the audited ones.
And so you would interpret that as if there is more impunity, then you can commit more serious cases, or if there are serious cases, then you try to avoid them much more.
Yeah, so of course the corruption, the causality can go in either way here, but our interpretation is that, well, if there is more impunity, then you engage in, or more perceived impunity, then you engage in more corruption, because you see that these cases are not going anywhere. But
you perhaps exploit a little bit the timing in a bit more subtle way, like only looking at past cases. It's never going to be very strong, but
good idea. Thanks. Yeah, so any more ideas on how we can sort of get at this causal effect of impunity would be appreciated. The problem, of course, is that we don't have that much variation, because all of these cases can be appealed to the same appeal court and the same superior court and the same Supreme Court, and delays happen there as well. Okay, so our findings are somehow at odds with the findings in Avis et al. 2018 Journal of Political Economy. So what did they find? Using the same setting and similar data, they found that audits did lead to legal sanctions, and they found that audits reduce corruption, and it does so because of these legal sanctions. This is sort of their results. So how do we reconcile this with our results? So first, we were able to reproduce their results, but they did not look at final punishment. But even with final punishment, we see a small effect. But also their paper, they did not comment on the fact, or they did not document that this punishment came too late, and that the punishment is very small. And this causal effect is extremely small. So why did we get a reduction in corruption because of these legal sanctions? This is probably not because of any final convictions, but it could come from things like lawyer costs, reputation costs, and so on that are associated with these lawsuits. So possibly there are large consequences for these individuals in terms of like paying for lawyers, but also reputationally, that could lead to deterrence and could lead to lower corruption. So this is our interpretation.
Time might be an issue as well. They use a lot of time on those, which prevents you from doing other business.
Yeah, definitely.
Including corruption.
Okay, so what are some of the broader implications of this study? So first, well, judicial independence is not a sufficient condition to fight impunity. We also need to worry about procedures, legal loopholes, and court congestion. And in terms of deterrence, fighting corruption, well, in combination with Avis et al., our results indicate that even though there is no final punishment, these lawsuits could lead to lower corruption because of these lawyer costs and reputational costs. But we argue that this is sort of an inefficient way of fighting corruption. So these lawyers who are working on these cases, they could have done something else more productive, right? And also, this system might not deter the big fish. So if you have a lot to gain from a corrupt activity, you might do it even though you know that you have to pay for these lawyers if the gain from the corruption is higher than the cost of the lawyer. So it sort of might work to deter the small level corruption, but not the big corruption. Relatedly, it could be the case that this kind of system favors defendants who are able to pay for lawyers. So what we did to check this was to see whether there is any correlation between the campaign spending of the politician or the declared assets of the politician and how they sort of behave in these lawsuits, whether they appeal at a higher rate, they enter with more complex appeals, or whether they are more likely to be acquitted or the case to still be undecided and so on. We did not find any effect here or any statistically significant correlation, which seems to indicate that this strategy of hiring these lawyers and entering with these procrastinating appeals is something that everyone in our sample can afford. So it's not something that only applies to the top politician, but also to anyone, basically. This is kind of surprising and not something that we expected when we started. Our results sort of suggest a number of possible reforms, such as reducing the number of appeals, reforming prescription rules, changing how we measure productivity for judges, decongestions, of course, making sure that judges are very fast at deciding these procrastinating appeals, and then having things like appeal deposits, that you need to deposit a certain level, a certain amount, the amount of the fine, for instance, before you enter with appeal. And we leave it to future research to sort of evaluate the effectiveness of these kinds of reforms. And there are some changes in Brazil that we could exploit. Another interesting question for future research is to think about, like, why is it the case that Brazil has these crazy procedural rules? Did the elite choose these rules like on purpose? And is this why they allowed for an independent judiciary? Because they know that the judiciary cannot touch them, in a sense. So there are many interesting political economy questions here, like why we have the system that we have. I'm also interested in knowing about whether this happens in other countries, or maybe impunity is explained by other factors in other countries. Like anyone who knows any settings, like including France, if you can sort of tell me about sort of the mechanisms of impunity in those settings, that would be very interesting for sort of the paper, but also for future research. Great, and also it's interesting to think about how this system affects the selection of politicians and democracy in general. Great, so I'm actually finishing very early. We have plenty of time for questions, right? But we don't have to take 15 minutes of questions.
Right. So we have time for quite a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Just on your point on other countries, do you have any sense of the length of these court turnover times in other countries?
The length of the court cases?
Yes.
Um,
in a way, like these appeals could also be an indication of a well-functioning judicial system, and so I'm just.
So, I mean, I think there are many opportunities of appealing in other countries, like including my own country. But I think one of the key differences might be that in some countries these are decided very fast, so it doesn't make sense to enter with this. But here it takes like, okay, you can enter with one small appeal and it takes a year to decide. But maybe in Norway it takes 10 days to decide, and then it sort of it's not worth it anymore. But yeah, thanks.
Do you observe some heterogeneity by age in terms of the politicians convicted or prosecuted?
No, I haven't.
Because when you think about those delays and the cost or the absence of cost involved, might somehow be related to the age. I'm just thinking, if I am 70 and I know that I will not be prosecuted over the next 20 years, it's not costly. If I'm 30, it's more costly.
Great, yeah, because these lawsuits take 20 years. If you don't have 20 years left, then you're you're not going to be punished. That's a good idea. Thanks.
So what I was thinking, that you're saying that this is about judicial independence, I think it's more of about the judicial structure, because they're using, it's not, if you look at independence, it would mean that the judges are not operating independently. But here, from what I understand, it is that they are using the appeals to try to delay the sentence. So it's about the structure, judicial structure, more than independence.
Definitely, yeah. So this is about like how you structure the judiciary, and it's also about congestion, of course. I mean, it could be that without congestion, that this system would work well. But in combination with congestion and these multiple appeal opportunities. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? So, do you kind of also compare the undecided cases amongst non-politicians? Because it could be just comparing the undecided, if these cases are undecided more than non-politicians, then that would mean that there is impunity for the politicians through undecided cases, no?
Yeah, I mean, it might be that there is impunity for bureaucrats as well, right? I mean, but yeah, we should make those comparisons.
Structure, then it's just the judiciary or
Yeah.
working slowly. Then
Yeah.
it's nothing about the politician.
Yeah, so my prior is that this would, I mean, any kind of bureaucrat who had the money to pay for a lawyer could do this as well. And it's not something about political influence over the judiciary. Like these are like mayors of small municipalities. They don't have much power in terms of like influencing judges and so on. Like, I mean, they might have something, but so we have another paper where we show indication of that, but they shouldn't have that much influence, especially over the federal courts.
And just to kind of look at judicial independence, maybe if you could look at the quality of the decision, or for example, something like if those decisions were actually better in quality, or they were just, if you have some idea of that.
Right, yeah. I guess you need to hire an army of lawyers to code the quality of the, but yeah, that would be great. Thanks.
So again, thinking of the kind of broader implications of the results, I think you should probably take a look at other outcomes than mayors' convictions, bureaucrats, or just people from the same municipality as the mayor. I'm not sure whether you can with your data. So what I have in mind here is sort of the typical corruption case that's picked up by those audits, which is problems with public procurement. Right, so here, the kind of two people that you might have evidence for are the bureaucrat who did the procurement and the firm who got the contract, right? Probably not the mayor. And so, of course, everything was happening kind of under the mayor's jurisdiction. Therefore, the mayor should be responsible in some way. But if the mayor manages to prove that like he didn't know, then it's probably going to be pretty hard, right, to have conclusive evidence for this person. So I wonder whether you find, well, bureaucratic convictions, or I think it might be more promising to look for convictions of the firms that did the procurement. The reason I'm saying this is because, again, between the bureaucrat and the mayor, you could try to sort of bounce responsibility around, right? And the mayor's like, well, I didn't know, and the bureaucrat arguing that it wasn't him, he was being forced by the mayor, right? And that might be the fight that lasts 20 years and never ends, right? While convicting the firm might be a little more, a little easier.
Okay, great, thanks. Great idea.
Yeah, and also in terms of outcome, that's quite interesting to look at for these audits would be the effect directly on the election themselves. Because I guess that like the mayors are public personalities, and that the cases might be known by citizens when there's one, especially if the localities are small. And I was wondering if it might enhance the probability of being elected, or conversely downgraded, depending on the way people feel about their mayor being prosecuted by basically the state, which is represented by those.
Yeah, so there are papers showing that the audits they affect the votes for the mayor. Like if you're audited and there are bad findings, then you get less votes. And then there is this like Avis et al. Who shows that, well, but this is not actually deterring or preventing corruption, because politicians, they have so small chances of being re-elected anyway. So they argue it's more the legal sanctions that discipline the politicians. Certainly.
So I had something a bit along the same lines, but I'm still a bit puzzled that it's not all clear. So first, the results of the audits are public. Okay, so the citizens know it, presumably.
Yeah, I mean, there are people arguing that the citizens know it.
But so because why do they appeal? I mean, it seems it's not really to avoid the sanctions because they're mostly small, right? That's what you showed us. I mean, at least in the standard cases. And then I guess it's to be able to keep politics to be elected, but you just say that it does reduce the priority of being elected. And so it would be interesting to see if it's right after the audit, but before being, say, sentenced in the first case, or whether you need to wait for the proper sentence of a judge to be sanctioned by citizens. Because if it's just the audits, then you could, indeed remove all those loss of money and time of the trials, which seem useless. But presumably it's not enough. And so it would be very interesting to understand exactly the cost and benefits of politicians that have been audited to go through this long procedure. Because to me it seems there are things that goes in different directions. So there is some disciplining effect. So there are a little bit sanctions in the earns, and it seems they do less corruption. That's the other thing. But then why do they need to do that? If they are not sanctioned legally, and again, it seems they can keep being elected anyway. So
Good, yeah.
to a certain extent.
Great comments. Yeah, so in another project, we're trying to look at if the lawsuits influence voters. You could imagine that the conviction, while it doesn't lead to any legal sanctions, it makes it more salient to voters that here, this is a potentially corrupt politician. Like that the audit themselves might not sort of be able to say that this is the mayor, but the lawsuit would say like, okay, the mayor is convicted. So definitely this is something that we're working on.
Conversely, whether a positive audit or the audit that did not find anything serious could be sent as, it could be beneficial, to gain votes, because you say you have seen.
Yeah, I think there's even the original papers showed that that's the case actually, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all for your attention, and I'll see you next week, I believe.
Great. Thank you so much.